Good morning, Professor Spooner. How are you?
Good morning, Frank. I'm fine, and I hope you are as well.
I am, thank
It's
you.
been another exciting week, and we've said before that this is the crucial phase of globalization, and we've drawn attention to the fact that everything that seemed to be well organized in the past now is not well organized, and that we need new forms of organization, and it's very difficult to work them out. And last week we talked about the problem of people feeling they're left out. And this week, what's on my mind is the fact that I think the most important factor in globalization is the rise of awareness that larger and larger proportions of the total world population all over the world are becoming more aware of what is going on in a way that they in the past were only really aware of what was going on that affected them personally and locally. And we've got particular crises in the works at the moment, not only in Washington, which probably gets most people's attention, but in Paris, this rise of resistance against what Macron is doing. I mean, he came in as a very popular electee, a very popular new president, and now his approval ratings are down into the 20s.
Right.
And it's another very interesting factor of globalization. I think that we're talking. Well, another thing that's happened this week is the conference in Poland on climate change. And what people haven't really realized is that everything that is being decided at these conferences that we have to do to prevent climate change is going to hurt the people who are worst off in major societies.
Yes.
And the what's going on in Paris now is a rebellion against the increase in taxes, part of which has to do with helping to play a part in the move against climate change. So it's another of these factors that makes democracy very difficult in the modern world, and it's exactly the opposite of what everybody expected. They thought that democracy would gradually become more and more popular, as in fact it has, but the thing is it doesn't work anymore. We have an administration in this country which was not the administration that got the majority of the votes. This sort of thing keeps happening.
Well, your point is well taken. If you look at the fuel tax in France and cross-referencing that to the conference in Poland and your observation about how these measures that are going to have to occur are going to hurt the people who can least afford to be hurt. I mean, the fuel tax, if you own a car and you live in Paris, you probably don't even notice the fuel tax because you rarely use your car. You use public transportation. If you live out in the rural areas of France and you drive 50 or 60 or 70 miles a day, you really notice the fuel tax. And that's where, in a contrast to what usually happens, certainly in France anyway, this revolution of the yellow vests has begun from the rural areas and worked its way in. All right, because these people have simply had it. They view this as one more tax burden. The other interesting thing I noticed that I don't know if it comes from Yellow Vest publications or whether it's true. I read that the French government collects 60 billion US a year in revenue from the fuel taxes, and only some 20 billion a year in that revenue is devoted to mitigating global warming processes. The other 40 billion goes into the general revenue pile, which further exacerbates the yellow vest people because their point is you're not even using all of our money to counter global warming. If you were doing that, that's something that we could understand on a philosophical basis. But let me just make one other point, if I may. I have dinner every Friday night with my wife, a fellow who's a stonemason, and another fellow who's a therapist, sort of an eclectic group. We have a pizza and some Coke and sit around and talk for a couple hours. Last night, for about an hour, we were talking about this, the yellow vests, France, the fuel tax. We're 3,800 miles away from Paris. I mean, this is very unusual. You talk about globalization. This was a fairly intense discussion. And it just struck me as I was driving home that 100 years ago, or even 25 years ago, we wouldn't have had this conversation. It would have been too far from home to be concerned about, number one, or to know about. So things are interlocking pretty quickly.
Yeah, and the question that arises again is how on earth are we going to be able to organize the world democratically so that we can take account of the different ways in which the necessary changes affect different categories of the population? Because in the past it didn't matter. In the past, people did what they were told.
It didn't matter. People did what they were told because one could perhaps say rather negatively that they didn't know any better. But now they know better.
Well, the society was organized in a particular way, which was the heritage of the medieval period, that people knew their place in society, and knew what they could play, the role that they could play, and knew the role that they couldn't play. And that's not the case anymore. Everybody thinks that they have an equal say, and that's, after all, what democracy is supposed to be. But it's becoming more and more difficult to organize it, and it's being noticed because I think we've mentioned this before, that the Atlantic Monthly had an issue in which on the cover page there's something like, "Is democracy failing?" or is this the end of democracy? I forget what the actual words were.
Well, let me ask you this question. One of the things we always have discussed in here is the alternative to democracy, which has sort of been embodied by President Xi Jinping in Beijing. How do you think that's working out for him right now?
Well, he's lucky in a way that the American administration keeps doing things that he can
yes.
he can present himself as being the efficient fighter against what America is doing. And now America has, of course, done something else. America thinks it can determine who can trade with whom.
Yes.
and somebody from China did something they didn't like, so they're having them arrested.
But he's still facing economic discontent there now, as a result of his unwillingness to bow down to American trade policies.
Yeah, but I'm afraid I don't know to what extent there is actual publicly expressed disagreement with what he's doing. It's difficult to tell exactly what's going on in China. But another thing that I wanted to bring up that relates to this is that so many of the things that are voted on that seem to be particularly important issues split societies down the middle, so the winning side it wins by 1% or so, and that was the case with Brexit. And now we've had over 2 years of negotiations of how to conduct Brexit, and it seems to be totally impossible to do it. It's easy to leave the European Union, but it's impossible to do it in such a way that it pleases everybody who wanted to leave without setting everybody who didn't want to leave against it.
Well, you raise an interesting point, because it's possible that these new globalization type of communication pathways that exist have led to the dynamic that we see, both with Brexit, both in the American political system with the rise of Trump, to the dynamic that the losing party never accepts the loss and continues to fight. They might legally agree with the legitimacy of the election result, but never give up and continue to fight back and continue to press their case. And that's certainly what's happened in the United States. And that's certainly been what's happening in the United Kingdom right now with those who are wanting to remain, not having given up and pushing and pushing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a healthy dynamic. I mean, whether you
Uh-huh.
disagree or agree with whatever the elected result is, I mean, one would think that at some point, in order to contribute to the greater good, the losing party would say, okay, well, that's fine. We lost. We'll wait to the next election and marshal our forces then, not continue to fight.
And it's also interesting that the way these things work, the relationship between public opinion and government, seems to vary a lot from one country to another. For example, the French have a heritage of barricades in the streets. I remember what was going on in the late 60s. But Germany, everybody conforms very publicly to everything that it's decided. And it's true that they now have this Alternative für Deutschland, which is opposing the government, but it's a very small minority, or it seems to be at any rate so far. And England, again, has a different way of dealing with these things. So it's going to be interesting to see whether with the well, I mean, the European Union is an interesting experiment, and it's difficult to see now how that's going to work out in the next few decades. But if it started with the two countries that had been at war with each other most and were probably most different from each other culturally, getting together,
Right.
deciding to
Right.
develop a union.
Right.
And they seem to, both of them seem still to be very much in favor of it, even though the way the whole thing is organized, even though it's expanded to 27 members now, even if England leaves,
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be interesting to see how the cultural heterogeneity
Mm-hmm.
of that part of the world, which is not really a very large part of the world, and it's a part of the world where everybody is very much aware of what everybody else is doing, but nevertheless has an enormous amount of cultural difference.
Yes, it does.
See how that actually comes together and manages to work together. And of course, at the moment, it's not working very well together, but the determination to maintain it and make progress with it seems to be well rooted.
It does seem to be well rooted, and it's interesting. And when you go back, you reminded me of something. When that original coal and steel pact was formed, I think that was back in the 1950s, wasn't it? It was
The mid 50s, yeah.
Yeah, it was 10 years after the end of World War II. I mean,
Yes.
it's unbelievable that in that short a period of time, they had come to that realization that this economic agreement was critical and necessary. It really, you wonder how quickly. It's amazing to me that things were able to change that quickly in that environment 60 years ago or so. With I mean, how quickly can things change today? If you look
Yeah.
at it that way. So it's an interesting thing. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about what's going on in France and what's going on in the United States and what's going on in the United Kingdom now with Brexit is twofold. Is that the people who have grievances, legitimate or not, in this case, I think many of them are legitimate, are really able to manifest those opinions in a very direct way and get results. So much so that Macron actually suspended the tax. And then the second thing is, how healthy is this to democracy as a whole, that the battle never ends, that you have a vote, you have a ballot, it's certified, and then the election is over. But, and speaking from somebody who I suppose could be construed as part of the resistance in the United States, I'm as guilty of it as anyone. But is there not a responsibility that I have as an American citizen to say, okay, we have a president, he has been elected and sworn in, and he will be there until noon on January 20th, 2021. Live with it. And
I think democracy has to have a structure which makes it possible for people to argue with the government between elections.
Hmm.
And in this country, it's very difficult. I mean, you've got the separation of powers, and you've got Congress, but what Congress can actually do in relation to the administration is very limited.
Hmm.
I still think that the British system, and to some extent some other European systems, are much better because the person in charge, the Prime Minister, really can't do anything without the agreement of the people around them.
Well, there's a very good column in today's New York Times you should read. The title is something like "What Would Happen if the U.S. Was a Parliamentary System." So,
Really?
yeah,
I must look at that. Yes.
after yesterday's news. So obviously the leader would be deposed and the problem would go away. So very much easier. Yes. So all right. Well,
Okay,
Professor Spooner, thank you very much. Good luck with your last week of class, and we'll look forward to talking to you next week.
good. See you
Thank you.
then.
Bye.